Today's guest is Wakanyi Hoffman. Wakanyi is a Kenyan-born storyteller, research, and global thought leader working at the intersection of education, Indigenous knowledge, and inner development. As the Director of Storytelling at the Inner Development Goals, IDGs, initiative, she brings forward narratives that center interconnectedness, Ubuntu, and the wisdom of ancestral cultures. A passionate advocate for reimagining education and leadership through the lens of relational intelligence and cultural humility, Wakanyi's work bridges modern development goals with timeless human values. The thing I really love is that she invites us to consider, what if the future isn't something we invent, but something we remember? Welcome, Wakanyi. I am so looking forward to speaking with you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, well, let's dive right in and start with your story. I'm curious to know what early experiences shaped your understanding of interconnectedness and Ubuntu, and then what does the word Ubuntu even mean? Because I'm pretty sure that's a word that not a lot of people are familiar with, but perhaps arguably should be.
Thank you so much. And can I just start by saying I appreciate that you have your cat in the background because that really helps me frame my answer to that question. I think my
Yeah,
it's
they're
brilliant.
always
It really
joining.
is. It's gorgeous. My earliest sort of introduction to this world of inner work or even Ubuntu, which I will get into, or interconnectedness is your question, really actually came from the more than human friends. And I had lots of cats growing up, so that was lovely to see. But also just the joy of growing up in Kenya at a time when I guess this would have been, I would consider myself one of the born free generation, in terms of post colonial Kenya. And so there was that. On the one hand, our parents had obviously grown up during colonial times, so they had a very different experience at that time in the 80s in Kenya. And they were raising their children in this post-colonial world, trying to educate them, give them a good education, get them ahead, a good start in life. And at the same time, they really protected us from that narrative of what the colonial trauma and the terror that they faced as children. So I feel like I had this privilege of a really wonderful all African experience. And I'm not sure how to explain what all African experience is. Maybe one of the last generations that had that experience where you had community, grandparents, aunties, uncles, everybody's part of your growing up. Really, I was raised by the village. When we say it takes a village to raise a child, I am a product of that village. Exactly. And so, in that sense, I feel like my inclination is always towards the connection with others in a most natural way, because it wasn't just my mom, it was my mom and all her friends were also my mothers. It wasn't just my grandmother, was also the grandmother to others. So there was this sense of community that I grew up in. And that really is truly what Ubuntu is. It is truly this idea of a person is a person through other persons. That is sort of the saying when we talk about Ubuntu. And for me, growing up in Kenya, which, by the way, I grew up on the edge of Nairobi city, so somewhat in the city, but not quite. So always in the middle of something, two different worlds. And on this one world was the oldest, I think, indigenous forest in Kenya. I think it is the oldest one. But at the same time, it is also a forest within a city. So there I was having this, experiencing the city growing up, coming up, and yet I have this ancient experience of what it means to be indigenous on an indigenous landscape. So that really helped me frame unconsciously, my understanding of interconnectedness, where my school was inside the primary school was inside the forest, which meant also that I had to go through this natural environment, with wildlife even, and lots, my playground was the forest. And then I had the home, and then I had the community, and witnessing a city, burgeoning, coming up. So all these dimensions played a massive role in my understanding of my place, not only in my family, but in the community and in the natural world. And then witnessing and wondering what that will look like in the future when this is all gone, which now it is. So that was my experience.
That sounds absolutely incredible. And I think most parents would, I grew up like that. I grew up very
Mm.
much as part of a natural environment. And I think most parents and the most effective schools even are those that really introduce the natural environment into curriculum somehow. We've created this separation, I think, between us and nature, and there is no separation. It's a construct. We are nature. We are of nature. We are nature.
Yeah.
So I love that you were given an opportunity to grow up like that. And did you find at a certain point in time, you said it was unconscious for you? Were there moments and I guess I'm relating this to your family, like your extended family, construct and environment, where it became conscious? Was there a conscious handing down of wisdoms and talking about wisdoms and framing of wisdoms for you as you were growing up that gave you a connection also to a deep heritage, a
Mm.
deep where you came from?
Not necessarily consciously in the sense that, there wasn't a day that somehow, the switch was turned on. I feel that just having such role models, witnessing the grandmothers being the wisdom keepers, sort of always planted that seed. I always knew that is a way to be. Like, train yourself to become a good ancestor as well. So there was always that. And so slowly as I grew older, I think that I felt like that was the way to be a human, right? Is to be able to role model, to embody the things, the ways of being, rather than speak about it. So nobody really came to me and said, oh, you have to be this way, or, you're going to be the next generation of wisdom keepers or anything like that. In fact, the very notion of wisdom keeping is somewhat contradictory. And even sometimes I hold it as a tension, like wisdom keeping isn't a job, it is a way of being. And so I feel that it really became clear for me that that is a way to be when I became a mom. So being a mother myself reminded me of my role, not only as a mom to my children, but actually to all the children that will be sort of coming through my hands through my own kids. And that helped me really feel like, yes, this is the job to do, this is the work. It's not just the parenting, it's not just the taking care of the children. It's also beyond that. It's who am I to them? How am I kind of helping them become human themselves? So really digging, like looking at myself and what are my values actually, and what do I embody, and how do I show up in the world, so that when they look at me, we all look up to our parents until we don't, right? When they look at me, what do they see? What are they looking at? Who are they trying to emulate? Who are they trying to become? And so that was clear for me, that it began very early on in my childhood. And then of
Mm.
course when I became a mom, it became quite clear. It was a very clear moment when I had my first child.
Yes, it's a cliche, but it made me think, be the change you want to see in the world. And there's something about not walking, not talking the talk, but walking the talk and leading by example, right? And I think embodying you being surrounded by, particularly it sounds like matriarchs and
Mm.
very strong female presence. I think that is extremely influential in how, and probably in your view of the world and what has shaped your thinking too.
Yeah, they were amazing. And I want to add, they weren't even sort of your typical matriarchs. They were not imposing in that sense. They were actually quite quiet and joyful and all the things, you know. It wasn't like this strong mama in the village that makes you frightened. I mean, there were some mamas like that, right? There's always that
The
one.
ones who've got the flip-flop or the whatever it
Right,
is. Yeah.
exactly. But I didn't have that. Like my mom was always kind of very practical woman in the house. She worked and she raised us and she did all of that. And then of course there were aunties and but my grandmothers and her friends were these joyous, joyful women that I just loved being in their presence. And they tended to us sort of in the same way that they tend to the goats and the sheep and the cows, you know, you're out there, do your thing. But if something happens to you, I will be there. So there was this safety around us, but not an imposition, no rules and authority. And so even to your question, you know,
Mhm.
was there a moment where I felt like, okay, this is my job? It wasn't. It was a privilege to witness
Yes.
them in that way. And then I felt like, wow, that is one way of being. And so I became that way.
Oh, so beautiful. Well,
Mm.
so fast forwarding to now, I mean, you've lived and worked all around the world at this point. And so growing up like that and the concept of Ubuntu is traveling with you and it's very much a part of your essence and who you are. Um, how has that shaped your view of what it means to be human in this moment of massive global transformation?
So I'm sitting with that question all the time. Oh, Ubuntu, the word itself, means being human. It's two words, Ubuntu, and it literally translates to being human. So you can imagine at this point in life when we're grappling with the idea of what does it mean to be human in the face of artificial intelligence? What does it mean to be human in the future, in the polycrisis? Like the essence of our identity is being questioned in all manner of ways. And so for me, having that, sitting with that question, firstly, gives me a sense of almost like an obligation to respond with this way of being, right? That I know, right? There's other ways, but I really do feel that Ubuntu is a way, not only, it's almost like a placeholder for what we mean when we talk about human values, like collective intelligence. And while it may have originated from Southern Africa, and there's a lot of kitchen wars about who owns the rights to the word Ubuntu, right? But and even some philosophers and academics and researchers on the continent, rightfully so, will say, well, I don't know about the Ubuntu thing. But when you travel across the continent, you will find an Ubuntu way of being. This is the sort of the communal, the plural way of seeing yourself through others. And what better way of responding to this question? What does it mean to be human? To be human really doesn't happen in isolation. And of course, now we're looking at this problem of belonging and loneliness. That also, those are all symptoms of a much bigger problem, which is what is going on at the root level. What is happening? How do you feel about yourself as a person? And so this saying, a person is a person through other person, also indicates that being in a social network of connections that are authentic, that feed into your soul of your being, that is a way of being human, that you can't be human in isolation. And so that's how I look at the word Ubuntu. And that's what I hope to bring in this narrative, in this whole entire conversation about what does it mean to be human and what is the polycrisis requiring of us. In fact, a question that I sit with is, who do we need to become? Like we need to leapfrog into something else, right? Beyond our biases and our differences and all of that, without flattening any of those experiences. We need to see who we need to become. And that's why, for me, this idea of my grandmothers having shown me how to be, I could look at that and I could see myself becoming that way. And that didn't mean that I needed to copy their way of being, but I could see myself taking those values of Ubuntu, of being, and then making them my own in another world, in another way, in another generation. And so here I am now. I am that elder, sort of, and I can still speak to Ubuntu. So it is a timeless way of being. It is not even a philosophy, but it is a way, a lifestyle, a way of truly seeing yourself as a mirror of the other person, and seeing in what way can I add value to your life in the same way that you're adding value to my life. And when we look at that, imagine walking around the world with that idea, with that way of thinking, how differently you would look at other people, because you're seeing the problem that you could solve in another person's life, not as a threat, but as an invitation to extend the compassion that you would expect to have from that particular person as well. So it becomes this sort of collective way of consciousness raising, right? Becoming consciously aware of who we are together.
Yes, I absolutely love that. And I love the idea. I mean, that it really is the definition of interconnectedness.
Yeah.
Net. So for anybody who's thinking about, I mean, you just there is no direct, well, there is a direct translation in English, and that what you just described does feel like it's an antidote to some of our current systems. I mean, we're all like community and co-creating and collaborating and, trying to repattern our current systems to build and create a prosperous future that works
Mhm.
for everyone, is really, we're in this really critical moment in time, it feels like. So, do you have any thoughts around how people can integrate this into education, into leadership, into everyday life? I mean, how can we consciously practice Ubuntu?
I think storytelling.
Mm,
It is such a cliche, but the reality is that storytelling is still the one tool that we will take with us, despite artificial intelligence, despite, in Africa, there's a saying that the most important person in the room is a storyteller, right? So think about it that way. When you're in a room, what story are you bringing, right? So the story is the most important thing, actually, not even so much the storyteller, but the story that you're sharing. So I think that building spaces, especially, and I love that you talked about in education spaces, building storytelling into the curriculum is a timeless tool that has not failed us as humanity to discover what it is that we don't know yet, right? And what are the problems that we don't know yet? What are the solutions that we don't know yet? And I mean, that little child that sits quietly in the classroom, the minute you sort of lure them into a story or bring out a story out of them, you discover something new about someone you didn't know. So I think that we need to figure out ways of truly speaking to our personal narratives without any sort of inhibitions or shame or wondering, right? And also to do it in a way that is deliberate, that is going to repair the fabric of whatever relationship that you're in that moment. So being able to tell a good story is not enough. It's also what is the story for, right? What is the purpose of your storytelling? And being able to share that personal narrative, because that's how you connect. As soon as you tell me your story, suddenly I feel like, oh, I know, I've got that feeling as well, or I've got that experience as well. Personal narratives will not fail us. And that's really what we have going for ourselves.
do you feel like there's a tension? Because I know that you're also involved in sustainable AI. So, is there a tension that you find between this very human connection, interconnectedness, the importance of storytelling, and technology? Like, we are human, but we are also humans relating to technology. And so, how do you see it, bridging that divide? And
Yeah.
because there is a distinct separation, yet there is also a way in which technology is so intertwined and will be forevermore in our lives.
To be fair, I'm concerned about technology um, feeding us one story, sort of that, to quote Adichie, this the narrative of the single story, right? The danger of the single story. I feel like that could be, and this is why I encourage anyone who is going to be engaged with AI in any way to really be mindful about what is it that we're putting into the system, right? What is the content? Because all that is stories, right? Data is our collective intelligence. So whatever we put in, that's what we get out. I heard recently a very lovely way of framing this. It's AI is this non-defining amplifier. It can amplify anything. So if we throw junk in, that's what we amplify. If we throw values in, that's what it amplifies. If we throw Ubuntu ethics, that's what it amplifies. So yes, there is a tension between who we are and how we're using technology and how we create that hybrid experience. And of course, let's not forget that not everybody on the planet has access to technology, right? So being mindful about whose stories are not being told and whose stories are being represented or misrepresented. I think the colonial narratives have influenced our ideas about who we are. And we all need to do that in our work, really, to look deeply into ourselves and say, barring this experience, what is my story? What are my origins even? And I really do encourage people to look deeply into sort of your lineage even, your ancestral narratives. I have that privilege of looking back and seeing my grandmothers, great grandmothers, and all of these great women who shared with me all their stories. But not everybody has that privilege. Maybe this is an invitation to look into that and see, hang on a second, how is this story? Does it match what I am learning now about my own people, right? And then bringing those other different stories so that we can build a bigger sort of storyboard of who we truly are as humanity. Because I really think that we're looking at this from one single story, and that single story is being fed with the same narrative over and over, just different
Yeah.
day, same story. Yeah.
Yes, and it's a very dangerous way to look at the world. Yeah. I mean, we think about that all the time in terms of interacting with AI. What are we feeding it?
Mhm.
You know, and I think we're in this moment of recognizing, collectively recognizing the role that colonialism has played on the planet. And so it does beg the question, and I'm curious if you have a point of view around how we can elevate African and all Indigenous knowledge
Mhm.
systems as being somehow equal contributors to this global future.
Yeah. Well, firstly, if anyone is on any sort of platform or you have some kind of platform, give Indigenous voices that platform, right? I tend to veer away from representing and more inviting or even being invited. I always wonder about people who don't even want that seat at the table. Be curious about that,
Yes.
Don't
Yeah.
just make the lovely table. Be wondering, be curious about, would this be the table that would be inviting, or do I need to step aside and be invited into? And also we need to ask ourselves, especially those of us who are able to do this, to be able to speak like this, ask ourselves, what is the intention at the end of the day? What do I want to bring into the world? How do I want to elevate Indigenous voices? I work a lot with Indigenous people, and there's a huge hesitation to be part of this technology, and this world, rightfully so, because if we look back historically, the colonial history has done this before, right? So this seems like a repetition, like, oh, we've seen that story before and we know exactly how it ends. But I think there is also an opening, a space for really sitting with questions and being open to being wrong, being open to awkwardness, being open to these long, lengthy, silent moments that then something else might emerge, and being open to other ways of knowing. I'm in academia, and I think that that is one place that really needs to transform the way in which we look at knowledge. What is knowledge? What is true knowledge? What is science? What is not science? And really kind of be open to discovering other ways of knowing that have been always there, right? But now we are seeing them kind of coming into the forefront. And so I think that, to your question, Africa is full of stories. Africa has always been telling stories, right? And I think there is an invitation to listen, to really pay attention to what the culture means. These are cultural nuances. There are thousands of languages being spoken on the continent. It's not one country, it's various, it's 50 countries in one, right? And understanding that also the old Africa is gone and there's a brand new Africa that has been building for a while, and it will keep reinventing itself. And that requires honoring that space, that there's a new generation of Africans who are not their grandparents, who are not colonized. They are reclaiming their pre-colonial narrative and bringing it into the future. And those stories need to be told in a particular way. And those people telling those stories need to be given those platforms to be able to speak in a particular way.
Mm. I don't know if most people know that. I mean, they probably do, but just in case, there are 54, I think it's 54
Yes.
countries that make up the continent of Africa. And I find that when people are describing Africa, it's Africa, like capital letters, inverted commas, and you forget that is actually culturally such a rich place, and with so much diversity, and yet we often hear just the colonial story. And I love what you just said about the fact that the generation of youth is not growing up with some of the experiences that generations before them have had. So they're approaching the future from a point of view of hope and what's possible, and
Absolutely.
feeling as though they have a place in the vernacular, and they have a place in the conversation, like they have a seat at the table in what's happening in the world. And I think that's a really big shift, don't you, from what has happened previously, what we've seen previously of Africa. It does
Exactly.
really feel like Africa is rising.
Oh, absolutely. And I like that you said that, because also I want to just say that the Gen Z, who are my favorite generation, honestly, they are
I'm
incredible.
doing waving hands here.
Yes, exactly. They're incredible at reclaiming everything and
Yes.
decolonizing and deconstructing and being in community, all the things
Yes.
that we want to see. They have all the tools. They need our support. That's what they need. And they are, at least on the African continent, as curious as anyone else is about what Africa is, that Africa with inverted commas. They're also curious about that because they don't have necessarily the written knowledge. Everything was orally told until colonialism. And then now they're sort of trying to go back and going like, what was there before, so that we can see what was going on before and when we need to kind of weave that pathway back into a value system that works for who they are at the moment. And so I think there is and this is African youth and indigenous youth at the same way. They're also a generation that did not go through the horrors of being shifted out of their land and all of that. And they've also gone to different schools, they've had a different interaction socially and all of that. And they're also trying to reclaim what was there before. What we need, those of us in these spaces, what we need is to actually listen to them, truly listen, and see what is it that they could reinvent, recreate out of the ashes, right?
Yeah.
What are the gems of wisdom that they've discovered? And we really, and it takes a humbling stepping back rather than teaching them or claiming to know something, and also not imposing our own values and issues, our traumas, our colonial narratives, and actually helping them find ways to find their own voices and reshape their experience, not discounting the experience that we had, but actually seeing that maybe there's a way to leapfrog. There's a way for each generation. There's a place for each generation. And that there is a place for their generation to see themselves as global citizens who are functioning at a local level as well, which is something that
Yeah.
maybe our generation didn't quite grow up like that.
No, and I also wonder too if, from an Indigenous standpoint, I think Africa is such an ancient country and it has such deep cultural history that I love that part of what we're seeing is that the Gen Z and Gen Alpha are actually, they're not, I mean, Gen Alpha less because they're not old enough yet to
They're still
really
babies,
embrace
yeah.
they're sort of
I have a
babies
bunch of
still.
kids, so I know them all.
Yeah, but that there is a willingness to really embrace their Indigenous nature. You know, they're not shying away from that. They're really embracing that as part of who they see themselves as being in a way that I don't know happens in many other cultures or many other countries around the world. Certainly, Western cultures, I think, have a real struggle with that.
Well, I think culturally, what comes next, right? I think we're in that season of what now, what next, right? So colonialism happened, and those who suffered the ills, the worst of colonialism, I would say, is my parents' generation, and then we less so, right? But we still had to bear the brunt of building a new country and creating something new that is African, but still very much framed around a colonial way of being, right? English was better than any vernacular language, that sort of thing. But now the next generation, who are now my children, are going like, well, I can speak several languages. None is superior to the other, right? So in that way, yes, they are reclaiming their indigenous roots or their pre-colonial roots, but they don't want to go back to some of those cultural practices, right?
Right.
They're
Yes.
looking at that as that was a cool identity. Now, how do we make a culture out of that moving forward and make sure that we don't lose the beauty of what was there before? And I love that. I love that there is
Yeah.
that sort of very intentional way of creating a whole brand new way of being, and which is local, but also quite global and international, and it is borderless and still reclaim the stories of the past. I just absolutely love that about them.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that too. It's so important. So I would love to talk to you about the Sustainable Development Goals and the
Mhm.
Inner Development Goals, because you, as I explained in your bio up front, are, is it a new position for you at the IDGs as their kind of chief storyteller?
I'm
Um,
actually a board member at the
a board
IDGs.
member.
Yes.
I'm sorry, giving credit where credit is due.
Oh, no, you gave me too much credit. I'm not the chief curator of stories. I'm a board member at the foundation.
Okay,
Yeah.
wonderful. So can you tell us about what the sustainable development goals are, what the inner development goals are, how they relate to one another, and what their place in the world is, like what we're trying to accomplish?
So the
Those two
Sustainable
great
Development
things.
Goals, which we all know, I think those are more commonly known, widely known, came out of the UN. So the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals have been around for, I want to say 10 something years, a decade, right? Maybe more or less. And so the SDGs have been around for a while. And I think the biggest criticism, I'm not a big critic of the SDGs, I'm a critic of the way in which they are implemented, right? So the implementation of the SDGs requires some kind of material wealth. And that means that we're back to the same old colonial story. In order to eradicate or to provide education for all, country X needs X amount of money in their budget to provide education. I'm just taking like SDG 4, for example, which is education. And so when you have that as the requirement, my question and my criticism would be what education, which education, and for who, right? Because it negates things like Indigenous education, which shouldn't cost anything. That's the education that I had, right? But it is not mainstream education in Africa. It's not considered part of the mainstream education system. And so, and when I look at that, indigenous knowledge, it is less about what you can do with the outside world and more about who you are on the inside. It's the heart of Ubuntu, right? So that kind of education is not accounted for in the SDGs. Do you see what I mean? And so the
Absolutely.
inner development goals, which are separate from the sustainable development goals, nothing to do with the UN, were born out of Sweden, from an organization which is the Inner Development Goals Foundation that I'm on a board of. And they were developed out of that need to look inward before doing that out, looking outside. Who do we need to become in order to achieve this sustainable development? Because, and I think it's a bit like even now as we're building AI, we need to ask ourselves, before designing, who do I need to be as a designer of AI, right? What are my values? What are my moral, ethical considerations? What's my understanding of the problem that I'm trying to solve? Is it even a problem that needs this particular solution? That requires an introspection. And that's the beauty of the IDGs, the inner development goals. It's all about introspection. It's all about really, as an individual, looking deeply within yourself to see what are the deep-seated biases that you might have, what are the deep-seated issues that you might have to work and heal within yourself before whatever you can create on the outside. So the inner development goals are not the opposite of the SDGs. They're actually complementary. In many ways, in fact, I say that it fits right at the center of that SDG circle. You could just put the inner development goals at the center. And that's where we need to begin. And for me, I think then the response to that for myself is Ubuntu. Ubuntu is the art of being human. And if we're going to look introspectively, we're actually questioning, who am I? What kind of human being am I? And that's inner development for me.
Mm. I know there's a framework that it comes with. Can you tell us what are the inner development goals? There are 5 of them, is that correct? Which then break down into sub
Oh, there
groups.
are so many.
So many.
That's a trick question. I think there's like 20 something.
Oh my God. Okay, I
And I'm
don't
not an
expect to
expert
remember them
at
all.
remembering them all, but
What
I
are
will,
some of them? What do you think some of the capacities are that are most urgent for
yeah,
leaders, and especially women, that
yeah.
we need to develop, and particularly in face of what we see happening around the world?
Yeah. So sensing, thinking, feeling, these are at least some of the ones that I can remember. And I think that word sensing has an energetic feeling, right? It creates a sense of something in you. And I believe that as women, this is what we have. We have this sensibility. And imagine being honored for something that almost comes naturally for women, right? I don't want to say that it doesn't come naturally for men, but I think women just have this sensibility, right, about ourselves. And also, and it's something that's not celebrated, especially when you're talking about, whether it's in the corporate world or even in research, in academia, being a sensitive person that is inclined to that sensibility, sensing into things, being able to see what needs to happen in a room. How is the setting even? What are the optics of the room? For example, I'll give you just a quick example. I was working at the new institute in Hamburg, which is a research institute. It's a wonderful place for all kinds of people. So it's an interdisciplinary kind of place. And while I was there, I put together a project, a workshop where I brought together Indigenous leaders, Indigenous wisdom keepers inside this, very traditional German institution with academics, with practitioners. And I had to really sense into what this format would look like. And I feel like just that way, because that was acceptable, right? Me coming in and saying, maybe we need to set up this room in a sort of, the chairs need to sit in a circle. We need to all be facing a particular way. And maybe we need to include ceremony. I couldn't believe how well received that was, but I know it's not the norm. right? Such a thing would not be acceptable everywhere. So having that kind of space, or being able to have people understand that there's just simple ways of bringing community together. And then whatever it is that you want to discuss, whatever the project is, whatever the workshop is, can be done so much more effectively if you use that principle of sensing
Mm,
something and thinking beyond thinking, right? Not just like thinking with the head, but actually the whole spectrum of thinking and feeling and being present, which are all considered these soft female skills.
yes,
But I
yes,
think
yeah.
I think the world needs a lot of that. And I think, well, I don't know if it's in the circles that I operate in. I feel like that is much more acceptable and appreciated. But we need it appreciated even more, especially in
Absolutely.
places of power. Yeah.
Yes, could not agree more. And in fact, Nancy and I have been talking about it lately as through the lens of quantum, quantum
Mm,
connection, and that it's time for us to balance out the cosmos in a way,
mhm,
if you want to think
mhm.
about it in that way, um, and reintroduce and re-recognize the feminine, the importance of the feminine in all of this. And
Yeah.
and by that, it doesn't mean men versus women. It's got nothing, absolutely nothing to do with that, and
Yeah.
everything to do with reestablishing some balance. And we talk about it as the feminine's skills as being which are very much needed at this moment in time. I could not agree more. Like emergence, fluidity, sensing, and that
Intuition. Just being able to use
intuition.
that
Yeah,
intuition.
big
Yeah.
one. Yes, yeah.
Absolutely. And that's a requirement of being human. They're not separate from, and I think I love that you said that that needs to be amplified. And it doesn't mean that men don't do what men do, but it only means that maybe it's time to harmonize the two. And I think that women have had to develop those masculine parts of themselves, so it only makes
Yeah.
sense that men also could develop those feminine parts of themselves, and then we can do this dance in a more harmonious way. And think about how many connections we would be making neurologically. Like think about, that plasticity, neuroplasticity that we talk about, right? It is all in those connections. Once you open up a part of yourself, it opens up another connection. So it isn't giving up one way of being. It's actually amplifying a way of being human. It's expanding. And I love that you use the word quantum because it's doing these quantum leaps or quantum connections. It's opening many pathways, possibilities. It's not just one linear path towards X or Y or Z. It's I can get to X this way, or I could even look back and pick up something that I forgot behind. All this happens when we expand our field of vision. And I think this is what this feminine energy actually brings. It is an expansion of that field of vision.
1000%. And actually, there's a really wonderful quote by Meryl Streep,
Yeah.
who said famously last year, we've spent thousands of years learning the language of men, and now it's time for men to learn and understand the language of women.
Absolutely. I couldn't say it any better. Only Meryl Streep can say it properly. The only
Right?
claim to fame I would lay with Meryl Streep is that I grew up on the Gong Hills. So have you watched Out of Africa? The film Out of
Yes.
Africa.
Oh,
And it's her, and she begins with, I had a farm in Africa. I had a farm in Africa at the foot of the Gong Hills. And honestly, that line always brings me back home because that's exactly where I grew up. But yeah, beautifully said. Men need to learn the language of women. And it's not a
yes.
language, it's a way of embodying. It's an embodiment. It is an embodiment and it looks different. Again, the power of storytelling. It is different to the narratives that have been perpetuated by films and everything about what it means to be a soft woman, and ridiculed for being female. We need to tell different stories about what that feminine energy actually feels and looks like in a person. Yeah.
Absolutely. So this has been amazing and so insightful. And I do want to just ask you a couple of things to wrap up.
Mhm.
So when you think about the future, what is a future that feels worth working toward to you? And what do you think it's going to take to get there?
I think it's already in the making, but maybe we need to be consciously aware of it. I think children are desperately looking for role models. I think we all are looking for role models. I think a future that is worth walking into is firstly reshaping the idea of becoming a good ancestor rather than thinking of it as an ancient concept, like being like what does a modern ancestor need to look
Oh,
like?
I love that.
And those are the narratives that we need to bring into the spaces that we're all occupying. Have children understand that there is this other way, that there's a purpose to growing up, to growing older. You know, we've almost like demonized the idea of aging even. Like I want to age gracefully like a modern ancestor, and I want the kids to look at me and be like, when I grow up, I want to be like that. And so that to me is a good future worth creating, but it requires all of our effort right now. And this intergenerational wisdom, you know, holding the hands of the children and kind of sharing with them our stories of what worked for us, but not necessarily imposing those stories upon them, not saying, you know, this is how things have always been done, therefore you must do it. No, it's about becoming good at helping them adapt to ways of being with certain tools in their hands and telling them, this is who I'm becoming and this is who you could become. And they're the tools now, you know, go for it. I think that's the way forward.
Yes, and what you just said that really stuck with me, showing them or teaching them how to also view themselves through the lens of who might they be as an ancestor.
Hmm.
That's really profound. Like to think
Hmm.
about what you want your future impact to be, and
Absolutely.
fair enough that what young person is thinking through that lens, probably none of them. And
But you know
fair
what
enough,
I was
rightly so,
thinking?
but
I think at some point they do, though we don't give them enough credit. I think they always do. I have
Mhm.
4 children, and I think they're always wondering, what will I be? You know, how will I be? What will my home look like? What will my lifestyle be? You know, they're very intentional about the future life that they want to be in. They might not be seeing themselves as 30 years old, right? Because that's way too old. But they're definitely looking at themselves not in terms of age, but in terms of what they're desiring to become. And I think there is the narrative that we're spreading here sometimes have a tinge of hopelessness, right? Where we, you know, what is my purpose in life? Can we maybe reframe that to who do I need to be now in order to be that to complete that vision that I see for myself in the future, rather
and I
than thinking about purpose? Yeah.
so sorry. You
No, go
ca
for it.
No, I was just thinking, and to a certain extent, um to have humility and forgiveness, and to also acknowledge and understand and accept that it's okay to not know.
Yes.
We've gotten very uncomfortable with not knowing. Somehow
Yeah.
we get constricted
Yeah.
by what society thinks we're meant to be and we're supposed to know and we have to do at this moment in time. And I submit that we don't. It's okay sometimes for them not to know, because I think there is an intense amount of pressure on our youth to have it all figured out, and how can they possibly?
Absolutely. Knowing is an illusion of control, right? Once
Mm,
I think I know, therefore I'm in control, but you're never truly in control of anything that's going on outside of yourself, right? So being able to help them know how to know themselves, to manage their emotions, to manage their ways, their feelings, their thought processes, to manage what is coming emerging out of them, that is all one can do. And then whatever happens out there, will be a manifestation of what we have built inside ourselves. And I think that those are the kinds of stories that I wish and I hope that we see more of coming out. If we can amplify them with technology, that would be brilliant. But I think children really need to learn that it's okay to not know everything, but this is a process. The process is an inner journey. It's an inner development, really. And even the word development sort of, loses, it kind of reduces it to something measurable. But it's more, it's an inner adventure, the adventure of your inner landscape. Take that journey.
I
Yeah.
love so much. Um, this has been such an incredible 40, I think 45 minutes we've been chatting for. Wakanyi, I was really looking forward to this. I had seen you speak about some of these subjects, and I was aware of your work, but I really do mean it when I say um, the world is lucky to have such a beautiful, soulful, intentional human walking through it. And I really celebrate and admire the consciousness that you are bringing to our now, but also your interest and I'm trying to think of the right word. Um, your influence over our youth,
Mhm.
and the way that you are helping reframe the conversation around technology and what even is technology, and the importance of bringing all of our ancestral wisdoms and cultural histories into whatever the future is that we're building. And it just, I'm going to sleep a little bit easier knowing that you are out there working on that.
Thank you. Thank you so
So
much.
much.
Thank you so, so much. This has been a lovely conversation. Thank you for having me.
Yes, wonderful. All right, well, take care.
Yes, you
Can't
too,
wait
my
to
dear.
see what you do next.
Thank you.
All right.